What if I told you that a single man born in the dust of Punjab's battle-scarred plains rose to carve an empire so powerful, even the British hesitated before challenging him? And what if that same man, wrapped in a lion spirit, ruled not through fear, but through unity in a land divided by faith and blood? This is the story of the Sikh Empire of Maharaja Ranjit Singh, the Lion of Punjab, a one-eyed king whose court glittered with French generals, Afghan mercenaries, and Hindu sages. A ruler who turned a fractured land into a formidable kingdom stretching from the Khyber Pass to the banks of the Sutlej. While Europe trembled at the rumor of his cavalry, but beneath the golden glow of his lion throne lay secrets, betrayal, ambition, and the shadow of an empire destined to clash with the British. As we journey into the heart of 19th century India, you'll witness the rise of an empire that almost changed the subcontinent's destiny forever. Stay with me, because what began as a dream of unity would end in a storm of betrayal and war. Now, let's step back to where it all began. The city woke to hoofbeats and rumor. Smoke from 1,000 cooking fires curled over Lahore's rooftops, while the first light turned the Ravi to hammered bronze. Men leaned from lattice balconies, women whispered from behind doorframes, and children chased each other through alleyways that were suddenly too quiet. Outside the walls, a young commander with a clouded eye sat in the saddle, listening more than speaking. He had come with an impossible promise: no plunder, no fires, no chaos. Just order. Just a new beginning. Inside the ramparts, old chiefs argued over whether to fight or flee. And above it all, a single question hung like a blade in the dawn air. Would the people open the gates? To feel the weight of that morning, you have to see what came before. Punjab had been a cracked bowl for half a century, passed from invader to invader, each taking his fill and leaving the rest to dry in the sun. The Mughals had once stitched these lands with silk roads and red sandstone, but the seams burst under the strain of court intrigues and palace poison. Nader Shah swept in from Persia like a storm with teeth, tearing away treasure and pride. Ahmad Shah Durrani battered the plains again and again, and every raid left behind a map drawn in ash. Villages learned how to hide their grain and their daughters. Monsoon flooded the fields. Winter froze the bones. Between seasons, men fought for a share of a world that kept breaking. But while empires faltered, communities endured. In the Gurudwaras, people ate from the same pot no matter their caste, and the langar fires were never allowed to go cold. Bands of horsemen jathas formed around leaders they trusted, not titles they feared. Those bands became Misls, brotherhoods bound by steel and oath more than parchment. Rimgarhias, Banjas, Aluelias, Nake, Sukerchakias, names that sounded like the roll call of a countryside learning to breathe on its own. Sometimes they traded, sometimes they raided, often they argued. But they built something stubborn, a culture that refused to bow to any crown that forgot the people. From this soil, in 1780, a child came crying into the light in Gojanwala, the son of Mayan Singh, chief of the Sukerchakia Misl. Smallpox struck the boy early and left its mark, clouding one eye and pitting his skin. He did not look like the marble statues of princes that poets carved in their minds. He looked like the land around him, scarred, restless, tough. They called him Ranjit, the victor in battle. The name was a hope before it was a truth. His childhood was not a garden. It was a forge. He learned to ride before he learned to write. Learned to judge a man not by his silk, but by the way he held a spear. He watched his father return from campaign dusted in exhaustion and resolve, then watched him die sooner than any boy should have to. Leadership fell onto Ranjit's narrow shoulders like a cloak he'd have to grow into. His mother, Rajkaur, and the Misls veterans held the edges of power together while the boy learned a harder lesson than swordplay: how to make men follow you when fear will only take them halfway. He gave them something simpler than fear reliability. In one of his first campaigns as a teenager, he rode with a small detachment against a raiding party that had already burned 2 villages. The older men wanted fury, to answer smoke with fire. He told them no. He told them to sleep on it. At dawn, he positioned his riders in silence along a mango grove, then waited until the raiders dismounted to eat. The charge was swift and finished before the second handful of grain. He did not allow pursuit beyond the river. He did not permit the captured men to be beaten for sport. He returned the stolen oxen and told a widow to keep the extra sacks of wheat that were found stacked behind her ruined wall. In a land where leaders promised heaven and delivered ashes, a boy who said he would do one thing and then did exactly that felt like a miracle. And still, the world kept spinning, unpredictable and cruel. Lahore, the great city of gardens and gates, sat in the grip of the Sikh Misls. These were men with a reputation for courage and a habit of draining the treasury faster than they could fill it. Trade stumbled. Citizens paid, then paid again. When the Afghan ruler Zaman Shah rattled his sabers and marched south, the Banjas panicked and let discipline slip like reins through a tired hand. Rumor grew wings. Some said Zaman Shah would make Lahore his winter palace. Others said he would grind the city to powder and scatter it in the Ravi. In that uncertainty, the Banjas turned inward, counting coins instead of allies. Ranjit watched and waited, measured and quiet. He visited granaries himself to see if merchants were hoarding. He listened to old men talk about the color of the Ravi in flood years. He took tea with women who remembered what it felt like to smile at a stranger without flinching. He sent letters not to chiefs first, but to elders in the neighborhoods that made Lahore what it was, bazaars buzzing like hives. Weavers with hands like birds, calligraphers whose lines could make a king rethink his fate. He asked one question again and again: what keeps you awake at night? The answers were never about glory. They were about price, peace, dignity. When Zaman Shah's advance dissolved under the pressure of his own troubles, a hole opened in the web of power, and Ranjit moved like a hand reaching for a loose thread. In the summer of 1799, he rode to the walls of Lahore with an army that was not the largest the city had ever seen, but it was the most certain. He sent a message first: no plunder, no torching. Throw open the gates, and the city will be treated like a jewel to be polished, not a piggy bank to be smashed. Inside, the Banji chiefs hesitated. They had enemies outside and enemies in their own courtyards. The city was on edge, but not all fear runs from the same fire. Merchants huddled together and sent word to Ranjit that they would accept him if he could keep the streets calm. Clergy whispered that a ruler who promised to keep faith and protect shrines couldn't be worse than one who used God's name as a coin. The chiefs, seeing their support melt, fled under cover of a city that no longer wanted them. And the gates, that morning, swung open. This was the first payoff of a promise made at dawn. The soldiers held their lines. The market stayed open. A horse slipped on an orange peel near the Delhi gate, and a boy laughed. The sound felt like the first rain after a long drought. Ranjit Singh rode into Lahore, not as a conqueror howling for tribute, but as a caretaker looking for dust in the corners. He posted men at water sources to prevent stampedes. He visited the Badshahi Mosque and bowed his head, then offered gifts to Sufi shrines. In Amritsar, he would later gild the Harmandir Sahib until it caught the sunlight like a flame. In Lahore, he simply walked, taking the measure of a city he intended to keep whole. If stories like this make the past feel alive in your hands, and if you want more scenes that carry you straight into the streets where history was made, make sure you're subscribed and following along. We've only just stepped through the gate. Power, once captured, keeps shifting like a restless sleeper. Ranjit did not declare himself king from the ramparts in a blast of horns. He knew enough about crowns to distrust them. Instead, he built. He appointed a kotwal to manage the city gently but firmly. He audited the customs at the city gates, shaving corrupt edges off the ledgers. He sent envoys to the Sikh Misls who had watched him with wary eyes, offering handshakes instead of ultimatums when he could, and hard bargains when he couldn't. He visited Amritsar often, where faith braided with commerce, and let the associations of the holy city do what proclamations could not: confer legitimacy that men would fight to protect. It took 2 years to turn that legitimacy into an unbreakable chain. In 1801, under a sky so clear it looked newly made, Ranjit Singh chose a coronation that was more statement than spectacle. He asked Sahib Singh Bedi, a descendant of Guru Nanak, to place the saffron tilak on his forehead. He took the title of Maharaja, but when the scribes brought designs for new coins shouting his name, he shook his head. The currency would invoke Guru Nanak and Guru Gobind Singh, not Ranjit Singh. The kingdom's faith and steel would speak first. His name could stand behind them. Did you know that a ruler who could have stamped every brick with his face instead minted coins that left him invisible? In an age drunk on self, that refusal was both humility and strategy. Merchants did not have to ask how long his vanity would last. Priests did not have to wonder if their texts would be erased to fit a royal verse. Soldiers knew they fought for something they could whisper to their children without shame. Yet even as his circle widened, the center trembled. The Misls were not pieces to be swept into a single box. They were proud, stubborn, accustomed to their own drums. The Ramgarhias still held the great Zamzama cannon Banjan D Tope that had thundered across so many fights that people told stories about it like an uncle who never ran out of breath. The Nake watched the roads south and could still slam them shut like doors. The Aluwalias had friends in places where favors mattered more than fort walls. Ranjit worked the old magic of marriage as alliance. He wed Mehtab Kaur, then Raj Kaur of the Nakai family, whom he renamed Dater Kaur. Names and oaths weaving into a fabric stronger than steel. He kept the fabric mended by riding to tears before they became rips. The turning point came not in a palace but on a plain. Rival chiefs tried to test his hold by dragging their feet, then refusing levies, then blocking roads outright. Ranjit responded with a speed that made hesitation look foolish. At Amritsar. A white tent rose like a pale star on the Sutlej's bank, and men who didn't trust each other smiled as if the river itself might carry their words away. Quills were trimmed, maps were weighted with stones, no one raised a voice. That is how a boundary was born. The British envoy arrived with polished boots and a precise vocabulary, a man who liked his tea and his treaties equally well steeped. He spoke of friendship and free passage, of trade that would make caravans hum again. His eyes slid to the river, then back to Ranjit Singh's face, gauging whether the lion would accept a leash that looked like a garland. The Sikh ruler listened with his head slightly tilted, as if the envoy were singing a song he'd heard before in a different key. The Sut who bound the negotiation together was a single, beautiful lie, that lines on paper are softer than lines cut into earth. When the Treaty of Amritsar was inked in 1809, it didn't roar. It clicked shut. The British recognized Ranjit Singh's sovereignty north of the Sutlej. Ranjit agreed not to step over the river to gather the Cis-Sutlej states under his wing. He returned to Lahore with a document that pleased no one entirely and unsettled everyone just enough. Some Sardars muttered that he had given away a future for a signature. He knew better. The treaty freed his back. The British would not march from the east so long as his banner stayed on his side of the water. If the door closed to the right, the horizon opened to the left. That same evening, as the city lamps winked alive one by one, he studied his map again. The west was a chain of names that tasted of dust and pride, Multan on its mound, fierce and rich, Kashmir tucked in the lap of mountains like a secret jewel, Peshawar, the antechamber to the passes where empires go to be tested. Between these places lay chiefs who had learned to survive by reading the faces of conquering men and answering them with the language of delay. Ranjit didn't plan to shout. He would move like water and hammer like water, too soft where he must, cutting where he could. The first proof of his new intent came where few expected it. He tightened the drill. The old thunder of the Khalsa cavalry was as much a legend as a tactic. Brave enough to break a line and bold enough to chase victory all afternoon, but courage that arrives early and leaves early is as useless as rain in a stone jar. He needed steadiness. In the citadel's courtyard, in the morning shade, he watched squads march until they found the beat beyond exhaustion. He listened for the moment when feet began to fall as if the ground itself had turned into a drum. He promoted not the loudest, but the most exact. Diwan Mokam Chand's low voice could still a quarrel. His eye could measure distance like a surveyor and time a charge like a musician counts rests. When a rumor spread that the British had squares, that could not be punctured. Ranjit looked at his men's shoulders, not their swords, and said, Then we will learn to make our own square, and we will outlast theirs. Amritsar gave him his second lesson. It arrived wrapped in devotion and steel. Akali Phula Singh strode the parikrama like a verdict in blue, a leader whose faith ran so hot it could burn friend and foe. He saw sin the way some men see an enemy, clearly and from far away. One spring, word went out that the Maharaja had entertained dancers with too much abandon, that the line between pleasure and pomp had blurred into something that mocked the Guru's grace. The Akalis did not whisper, they confronted. In the shadow of the Ekal Tad, before a crowd whose silence bit harder than any accusation, Ranjit Singh stood without ornament and without his sword. He did not bluster, he did not call guards. He accepted the reprimand, bowed his head, and submitted to a token penance. The leather touched his back like the lightest tap. The crowd breathed again. To outsiders, it might have looked like a king humiliated. To the city, it looked like something more dangerous and more rare, a ruler proving he was not separate from the rules. The twist landed in the gut of every Sardar who thought a throne could float above the people's judgment. The Lion of Punjab could kneel when it kept the house of his faith standing. The West began to answer his patience with opportunity. Southwards, Multan glimmered through the haze, a city raised on a mound and ringed by walls that had shrugged off more than one promise of defeat. Nawab Muzaffar Khan sat in its heart like a man who knew the weight of both prayer and powder. Traders spoke of caravans taxed twice, of the Nawab's sons with tempers like firecrackers, of a treasury that jingled louder than the bells on a dancer's anklet. The city held the key to the lower Punjab's arteries, and its refusal to bend had become a dare. He did not rush it. First came Atak. In 1813, the fort where the Indus narrows and growls changed hands in a fight that felt like a chess game suddenly remembering it had teeth. Diwan Mokam Chand's soldiers held their fire until breath fogged. In front of them, then broke the Afghan line with a charge as clean as a cut. The fort's gates groaned open. Ranjit visited its ramparts and leaned into the wind that smelled of river and stone and faraway snow. The world beyond the Indus was not yet his to touch, but he had placed a finger on its wrist and felt a pulse. If the treaty had been the turning of a key, the siege of Multan was the first door kicked off its hinges. In the summer of 1818, the plains baked and shimmered, the horizon dancing in heat. The Sikh army coiled around the city like a snake around a stubborn branch. Mr. Diwan Chand, the siege master who loved calculation as much as courage, sketched arcs in the dust where the mortar should sing. Hari Singh, now a broad-shouldered, hawk-eyed, the very shape of audacity, walked the lines at dusk, speaking to clusters of men as if he were arranging a festival rather than preparing them to storm a furnace. At night, the besiegers could hear Multan breathe. Dogs barked. Some woman, somewhere, sang a lullaby as if nothing were happening beyond her courtyard. The citadel's silhouette bit into the stars. Inside, the Nawab prayed and planned. He sent sorties that stung and vanished like flies that refused to be caught. He promised rewards that made poor men dream. Cannon spoke at dawn. The Sikh guns did not waste anger. They spent it carefully on the same patches of wall until brick behaved like sand. Drums rolled and halted and rolled again. Tunnels crept. Beneath the earth, measured by the sweat of men who knew that a single misjudged inch could trade life for dust. When a mine went off, it threw up a fountain of soil and splinters that hung in the morning like a dirty rainbow, then rained down in a soft hiss. On the 12th day, the count had become a superstition. Not a number one breach looked like a door the city had not wanted to build. Akali Phula Singh's Nahangs fixed their gaze on it as if it had insulted their mothers. The order to advance rode down the line like a hawk skimming a field. The charge was not noble. It was necessary. Men stumbled, disappeared, reappeared. The ramparts snarled back with musket fire and curses. At the breach's lip, where the world narrowed to the width of a man's shoulders, the fight became an embrace only one of the two could survive. For a breathless run of minutes, victory and failure lay so close together you could touch both with the same hand. The Nawab refused surrender. He fought in the last courtyard with a stubbornness that would have been admired if it were not about to be buried. When he fell, it was not like a tree, but like a door finally unlatching. The city's defenders faltered. The citadel swallowed its own roar and went mute. By dusk, the Nishan Sahib fluttered above Multan, and the plains heard a sound that had been rare for too long, relief that did not turn into looting. Ranjit entered the city not with swagger, but with a stillness that made swagger look childish. He walked where the shells had pocked the walls and where the air still tasted of hot iron. He spoke with merchants who pretended not to tremble and with artisans whose hands were their entire family history. He forbade the mockery of the dead. He ordered the repair of wells first, palaces second. He knew that a kingdom that takes a city must then take responsibility for its mournings. That is where empires tend to fail, in the early hours when nothing is dramatic and everything matters. This victory reset the map inside men's heads. If Multan could fall, what else had been pretending to be invincible? He sent for reports the way a doctor sends for symptoms. Kashmir's governors, he learned, had been changing faster than seasons. Under Afghan suzerainty, turning a paradise into a ledger with too many hands on the pen. Peasants bent under taxes. Shawl weavers coughed into their looms. Bandits practiced a kind of freelance government on the mountain roads. The valley, ringed by pines and snow, needed more than a flag. It needed someone who understood that beauty and bread are not rivals. He gathered an army that knew how to march through heat and decided it would learn how to climb into cold. Summer 1819, the passes wrote their own orders in ice and slope. Goragali bruised the shins of old veterans who thought they'd seen every kind of ground. Horses slipped and recovered and slipped again, breathing steam into a sky that looked close enough to kiss. The men from the plains learned to measure their day not in miles but in switchbacks. At night the fires stitched a second constellation. Onto the mountainside, a quiet promise that the morning would find them still there. The Afghan governor of Kashmir, Jabbar Khan, trusted the terrain and the distraction of distance. He spoke of time as an ally, of snows that would politely end the campaign on his behalf. Night on the frontier sounds different. It's not just wind through tamarisk or the dry chatter of insects in the reeds. It's the pause before a horse exhales, the hush of men who have chosen to gamble tomorrow's breath on today's decision. Somewhere beyond the river, a watchfire blinked and vanished, as if the hills themselves were winking at a secret. Ranjit Singh stood with his hands behind his back, feeling the Sutlej's old bargain at his spine and the pull of the Indus in his chest. The question he'd carried out of Lahore hung in the darkness. Would the gates open again, this time on the road to the Khyber? He had learned when to be stone and when to be water. Stone holds a city. Water finds a way. On the eastern bank, treaties kept the British polite. On the western, the Barakzai brothers in Kabul were arguing like heirs in a house with too many keys. Peshawar had become the kind of place that survives by smiling at every visitor and trusting no one. The door to the mountains was swinging on a hinge greased with intrigue. It was the kind of hinge that squeaked just loudly enough to tempt a man who'd built an empire out of quiet audacity. The first letter he opened in Lahore had smelled like distance and salt. The message, about a diamond that wasn't supposed to move. Shah Shuja Durrani, king once and king in exile now, arrived with mournful dignity and a chest full of remembered thunder. He wanted Ranjit's help to reclaim Kabul. He wanted to be a ruler again, not a story. Lahore received him as a guest and held him as an asset. There are prisons with velvet cushions. There are bargains that wear courtesy like perfume. For weeks, Shia paraded his pride like a cloak until the chill beneath it began to bite. The negotiations were a duet in a minor key. Gifts were exchanged, and then hints, and then pressure, the kind you cannot see but can feel moving the furniture in a room. It ended in a chamber lit by lamps that gave more shadow than light. Ranjit, unadorned, listened as the former king finally said what both had known would be said. The Koh-i-Noor passed from one hand into another the way history sometimes passes through a single heartbeat. No trumpets. No gloating. Just a moment as light as dust and as heavy as fate. Some said he lifted the diamond and it threw a star onto the ceiling. He didn't wear it that night. He closed his fingers around it until the facets bit his palm and then placed it in the Tashikana. where treasures sat like prayers that had forgotten who first spoke them. The twist wasn't that he took the gem, it was that he turned its story. From that day, the diamond that had drifted with Afghan fortunes would whisper a different name when the lamps struck it. Power isn't always won by cavalry. Sometimes it changes owners in a silence that hums like a plucked string. With the East secured by ink and caution, and with a token of Afghanistan's old grandeur resting in Lahore, he turned west with a calm that made anxious men pace. Attock had already fallen to his banner, and the Indus there sounded like a drum a kingdom could march to. South had yielded Multan after a siege that made the air taste of brick dust and iron. North had opened into Kashmir after Shopian smoke drifted over a field where discipline learned to dance with daring. Now the frontier where legends go. To test their courage was pulling at him like a voice in a dream. Peshawar, his council gathered in the fort as winter. Let go of the plains. Den Singh Dogra stood slim and precise beside him, a courtier who had learned how to be the kind of mirror a king actually uses. Hari Singh Nawa came with the mountain in his shoulders and a patience that narrowed to a blade when needed. The European officers Allard and Ventura saluted with a neat economy that pleased a ruler who disliked waste. And Akali Phula Singh, blue-robed and unwavering, brought a kind of certainty that could set a room alight. They argued in a language made of facts and fear and memory. The Afghans would rally the tribes with cries that thundered down valleys like avalanches. The terrain would fight back on the enemy's side. But if they stayed away, the frontier would be an open door for trouble to stroll through whenever it felt bored. Ranjit listened, eyes half-hooded the way they are when he is deciding to do something that will live in the mouths of men for a very long time. He chose movement over stasis, pressure over patience. He would take the mouth of the Khyber in his hand and see if it could be made to speak in Punjabi. In early spring, the army crossed the Indus, where its surface was a skin stretched tight over muscle. The night air bit at knuckles and ears. Men warmed their hands over small fires and their courage over larger stories. The Faujikas marched with a rhythm that made villagers line the road just to watch. The older cavalry still rode loose-limbed, laughing as if battle were a friend they'd known since childhood. Artillery trundled in a slow, comforting growl, like a giant clearing its throat. They met the Baraksai alliance on the plain near Noshra, where the Kabul River bends and pretends to be harmless. Across the field, Azim Khan brother to Dust Muhammad arrayed a force sown from pride and zeal. Ghazis, their turbans wound tight, called out prayers and promises. The first exchanges were like hands probing in the dark. Smoke climbed into a clean sky and smeared it. Drums rolled and paused and rolled again, measuring out fear the same way they measured out time. Then the Green Ridge erupted. Afghan guns at Pir Sabak fired down like gods who had lost their tempers. The Sikh lines flexed and held, but a little shiver ran through them, not fear. Exactly, but the surprise of being hit in a place you had thought was strong. Akali Phula Singh saw it. He had the kind of sight that looks past smoke to the meaning inside it. Without waiting for permission, he spurred forward, a standard snapping behind him, his men answering with a shout that could split a stone. Their charge hammered against the ridge like surf against a cliff. The first wave was thrown back. The second climbed over them. The third found purchase. Somewhere in that tangle of badas and cries, Phula Singh went down and did not rise. The news moved through the army with the intimacy of grief and the speed of a rumor trying to outrun truth. For a heartbeat, the world narrowed to a point of pain so sharp it almost felt clean. Men looked to Ranjit as if sound were a thing he kept in his pocket and could hand out, now in the shape of an order that would make sense of the day. He did not wail. He nodded once as if the fury that hit him had a place to sit and had sat down. Then he looked to the guns. Ventura, jaw locked, repositioned a battery with the grace of a chess player sliding a queen. The next salvos walked up the slope in sober steps, stitching chaos closed. The infantry advanced in measured bites. Hari Singh Nawa, calm as a man considering which tree to fell first in a crowded grove, took the flank and worried it until it frayed. When the Afghan line finally buckled, it did not moan. It snapped. By afternoon, the ridge was theirs and the Kabul River ran past. carrying torn banners toward a sea that did not care whose grief it salted. Phula Singh's body lay as if sleeping. Ranjit stood beside the fallen saint and let the wind do the talking. He did not try to turn the moment into something tidy. He simply held it in his face long enough for every man watching to know it wasn't just a line in a dispatch. Then he turned to the west, toward Peshawar, because grief that sits forever becomes a kind of indulgence, and he had never had the luxury of those. Peshawar saw the banners first and then heard the drums, and both sounded like a future arriving uninvited. The governor, wrestling with cousins and creditors in equal measure, decided tribute was a more comfortable word than resistance. Ranjit entered the city with the dust of the march still on his boots. He smelled resins and bread in the river. Markets watched him as if trying to guess whether he would rearrange their shelves. He didn't. He rearranged the arithmetic instead. Tribute was set. Levies were made predictable. The governor was confirmed, for now, because sometimes the most useful change is the one you delay. He did not keep the prize by ceremony. He kept it by presence. Forts along the road to the Khyber were bolted tighter. Patrols learned every tree on the riverbank by name. He gave Hari Singh Nalwa the frontier like a craftsman receives a tool he's been longing for. The big man grinned the faint grin of someone who feels the right weight settle into his hand. Nalwa's justice was a language the border understood, quickly direct, unsentimental, memorable. Stories clung to his shoulders, a tiger felled with a single blow. A bandit chief who learned that mercy in the mountains sometimes has to wear a stern face so it isn't mistaken for weakness. Whether the tailies were embroidered hardly mattered. On the frontier, reputation is a currency that spends itself the moment you doubt it. The British pretended not to notice. They wrote letters that sighed with relief about stability and commerce, while recalculating the cost of a future quarrel. Company officers visited and blinked at the court's impossible pluralism. A Persian couplet sung to a Punjabi tune while a Frenchman corrected a Punjabi. Drill sergeant's wrist angle and a Pathan mercenary laughed into his cup. They ate sugared almonds and went home to write reports that never managed to capture how the room felt when Ranjit turned his head slightly and you realized he'd heard what you had not yet said. Back in the north, the mountain road taught him a subtler truth. Holding Kashmir had been an act of beauty and bureaucracy. Holding Peshawar would be an act of relentless attention. The first arrow fell before anyone saw the archer. It thunked into the parapet a hand's breadth from a boy's cheek and stayed there quivering, a sliver of silence where a shout should have been. Then the ridge woke up. Dust lifted, drums started, and the Khyber's mouth roared a greeting only the brave ever answer. At Jamrud, dawn sliced the sky thin and bright. Hari Singh Nalwa moved along the wall with the easy economy of a man who had learned that fear shrinks when it's asked to work. He spoke in a voice that could be heard without being raised, telling a gunner to lower, telling a lad to watch for flags rather than faces, telling everyone to drink water even if their throats felt more iron than flesh. Below them, the plain was beginning to sow itself with lines that were not shadows. Akbar Khan's host unrolled, steady as a scroll. Men in white with green banners, men in brown with turbans tied like challenges, horse lines that flexed and flashed, and here and there the glint of a kettle drum or a polished buckler catching a sun not yet cruel. They had chosen their moment with a strategist's bite. From Lahore the morning bells still chimed for celebration. No Nihal Singh's wedding filled the capital with music, and half the court was wrapped in silk and happiness. If the frontier wished to test its guardian, this was the kind of day it chose. Nalwa felt the knowledge settle in his ribs and did not let it travel to his hands. He knew what he was for. He had asked for this outpost with the thirst of a man who likes his water sharp. The first probes came light and fast. Afghan horsemen launched forward as if to kiss the wall, then veered to throw javelins that were laughter until they were not. Sikh skirmishers answered with a scatter of fire that snapped as clean as a slap. A standard fell and popped up again somewhere else. Orders slid along the parapet like heat. The fort was not large, but it had been built like a fist, every angle chosen by someone who understood where a blow would land. Behind its stones, discipline had learned to sit very still. When the main body advanced, it came with a sound that has no proper noun, only a feeling, as if the day were suddenly crowded with heartbeats that didn't belong to you. The first artillery rounds from the Afghan side came short, then long, then found their teeth. Stones jumped. Plaster sighed off a corner and fell in a soft powder. Now pointed and Ventura's gunners answered, the line of their fire walking onto the slope with a patience that made the young men nearest them breathe steadier without knowing why. Volleys went out in sheets. The fort's lower gate was tested and then bitten with a battering ram that translated the enemy's faith into physics. A runner came up with news that should have waited but could not. The Afghan right was trying to curl around to the water source. Nawa sent a reserve as if he were sliding one more log onto a stove, not as if a portion of his world were about to go cold. Then he paused, the way people do when they step from tile to carpet, and their feet register the difference before their minds do. A musket ball had found him. It came from nowhere and everywhere, from a window in the air, a gift delivered without ceremony. It bit into him and his body told the truth faster than words could. His knees failed him, and the stones caught him like an old friend surprised by the weight. He blinked at the blue sky and understood at once that the sound around him would change if anyone noticed. He pulled the nearest officer down, his breath quick and thin as a reed. The order was ugly and necessary. Lay me aside. Keep me quiet. If the men ask, tell them I am everywhere on the wall today. He was not a man who had practiced softness, but he used it now, letting his palm rest for a heartbeat on the boy's cheek who could not stop his eyes from filling. Then he shut his own eyes, and the world narrowed to the work of staying. In Lahore, a dancing girl spun until the bells at her ankles became a single long ring, and women laughed a laugh you hear perhaps 3 times in a life, when everything is unaccountably easy. Ranjit Singh smiled the way a tired man smiles when an entire capital has decided to believe in joy. Fakir Azizuddin leaned in and murmured a word that did not belong in a wedding. The Maharaja's face closed, not like a door but like a hand around a flame to keep it from blowing out. He did not run. He called for maps. He sent orders that began as questions and arrived as decisions. He told no one to quiet the musicians. He told no one to stop the dance. Back at Jamrud, the gate splintered and then held. The Sikh countercharge down the slope was not glorious. It was necessary, men moving as if pushed by the elbows of ancestors who had no patience for poetry today. The Ghazis came on with a kind of terrified courage that is frightening to stare at too long. Somewhere, Akbar Khan's drum called a rhythm meant to unspool an enemy's nerve. Ventura threw a battalion at the ridge where a pocket of marksmen had grown too sure. Tej Singh's cavalry tried a feint that was clever enough to shave a slice off the afternoon. Ammunition ran later than it should have and then arrived in a rush that made a cheer rise up and break into bits against the parapet. A rumor, heavy as a dropped axe, slipped through the ranks. Nawa was dead. It moved low and dirty, like a floodwater snake. Men gritted their teeth and acted like they hadn't heard it, which is how you can tell they have. At the citadel center, a curtained palanquin appeared briefly above the wall. A silhouette leaned forward, one arm raised in a gesture the entire army knew without ever having been taught. The curtain swung back. For a breath that could hold a life, Jamrud believed its lions still walked the parapet. The rumor slithered back into the cracks. The curtain disappeared. Orders came crisp. Whatever had happened would be spoken of that evening, not now. The fight ground itself into the kind of afternoon that ages boys into veterans by the time the sun moves a hand across the sky. The Afghans, gallant and relentless, stormed the same breach until it looked like a mouth the day couldn't close. The Sikh line bent where it had to and stiffened where it could, the new drill pulling courage into formations that could not be rolled up by a shout. By late light, an outrider came hard from the east with dust in his teeth and an answer in his eyes. Reinforcements, Kanwar. Sher Singh cresting the road with men whose faces were set in the way a jaw sets before a punch. The Afghan commanders saw the timing slip. They had wanted a quick break and the roll of victory toward Peshawar. They got a fort that refused and a horizon that promised fresh trouble. When the Afghans drew off at dusk, it was not with the collapsing sorrow of a rout. It was with the steady disappointment of a plan that did not find the 1 week seam it had gambled on. The field was theirs to leave, which is a kind of admission even brave men hate to make. Jamrud breathed a kind of involuntary gasp, followed by the quiet that always sounds like gratitude first and sorrow second. In an inner room where the stones are cool and do not gossip, the sheet was drawn over Hari Singh Nawaz's face, and the fort learned how to stand taller because it could not afford to bend. Ranjit received the news without moving a muscle and with every muscle altered. For a long moment he looked like a small, pitted boy whose body had learned before his mind what it meant to carry something too heavy. Then he did what he always did with pain. He set it to work. The first orders were hospitals and honors. The second were quiet replacements in posts that now mattered double. The third was an appointment that turned Peshawar from a rumor into a warning. Paola Avatable, iron-handed and meticulous, would govern the city. The frontier would know a stern face at dawn and a ledger that did not miss a single coin. In the bazaar, men spat when they spoke his name and then counted their takings with fingers. That did not shake as much as last month's on the road. Caravans learned that the price of an unmolested journey was a set of rules that brooked no story, no exception, and no late-night pleading at the gate. But a wall cannot be held by one fort alone. As if to remind him that empires breathe through more than one lung, news came not from the west but from the ceiling of the world. Years earlier, the Dogra prince Gulab Singh had put a blade of a man named Zorawar Singh into the saddle and pointed him toward a cold map. Now, reports of that march resurfaced in new light, carrying their own frost. Through Zanskar's cruel passes, across rivers that wore ice like blued steel, Zorawar had threaded columns where goats thought twice. Ladakh had learned the rhythm of his boots and fallen into the pattern. Monasteries that had outlasted dynasties looked down at formations that did not falter when the wind grew spiteful. Les flags fluttered under a different sky, and from those high flats the routes to western Tibet lay like pale veins waiting for a daring surgeon. Ranjit listened to the tale with a hunger he scarcely let show. The empire was learning how to walk in every direction at once. The British, who preferred to arrive in late afternoon with excellent manners and an agenda folded inside their sleeves, put forward a new proposition that smelled of opportunity and smoke. Lord Auckland's envoys came bearing a scheme polished in Calcutta and London both. Put Shah Shuya back on the throne of Kabul. They would do the heavy lifting by sea and desert. He would do the part that made sense for a lion who had learned to pace the Khyber's gate. They spoke of a balance of power that would keep Russian whispers beyond the mountains. They spoke of honor and partnership and the, shall we say, sharing of burdens.